Thanks for coming. This awkward hour in a busy schedule. It was the year 1992 when my family and I first arrived in Canterbury. We came from Macedonia, a new country which had just declared its shaky independence from the remains of Yugoslavia. In Bosnia, wars were in full rage. My son started Simon Langton's Boys, and my daughter St. Peter's Elementary School. One day in the schoolyard, I first met Nick Burton, a filmmaker and a lecturer at Christchurch University, then college. We soon started regular chats over coffee and beer. One of the first things he told me was that, as a child, the only knowledge he had about my part of the world was obtained from the comic book Tintin, in the episode King Ottokar's Scepter. I had myself grown up on comic books and a fair share of Asterix and Lucky Luke, but Tintin was not my staple diet. I was curious to read it, and when I did, I found out it was a spectacular travesty. How could someone be so random, so casual, so whimsical, and so wrong? This flared up my interest in things random, casual, whimsical, and wrong, also known as stereotypes. You'd say, but it's only a comic book, and I'd say, but it's still comically wrong. Let me start with some stereotypes about England, which are commonly held in my native country. My uncle Risto, who is now in his 80s, must have seen the film or read the book of The Canterbury Ghost. To this day, he asks me if I live in a ghost house in Canterville. To say no would be cruel. It would demand too difficult a readjustment on his part. He's also never bothered to inquire what exactly it is I do for a living, although he did once ask me if I speculated on the stock market. Many of my countrymen still believe that there is constant fog and smog in London, and that Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes are still about, and what they forget is that our own towns in Macedonia have recently become Victorian in their pollution and crime. In my homeland, there is still the frequent usage of the phrase, cold as an Englishman, which means that people are distant and how could I possibly live there? However, they all nod in admiration at the mention of English perfect lawns, a result of little rain and centuries of mowing care. And how is it in London, they ask me? I don't live in London, I say I live in Canterbury. Still, they say, how is it in London? Which London, I ask? There are many Londons. Have you heard of Neasden? They haven't. Well, I say 1 million people live in Neasden, it is in London, and no tourists ever go there. Most people in my country, particularly those who don't speak a word of English, know one phrase: go to your sketch mother. There is a widespread belief that that is the worst possible thing you could say in the English language, the ultimate rude phrase. Just where has this conviction landed from is a mystery to me. My brother, when he visits London, is in no doubt where we must go. First, shopping on Oxford Street, and then a visit to Madame Tussauds and the Millennium Wheel. Yeah, but didn't we do that last time? We did, but we'll do it again. What else is there to do? Neasden, I think to myself. So, in the Balkans, there is an imaginary country called England, and likewise and naturally, here, there is an imaginary country called the Balkans. Veritable bags of cliches. I once asked Dr. Andy Birtwistle to give me a one-liner about a man from the Balkans, and he immediately improvised something like a gold-toothed gypsy horse thief. Let's look at an example. This chap is from the Middle East, just a little to the east of the Balkans. He is a peddler, a lamp seller, who appears at the very beginning of Disney's Aladdin. In fact, he introduces the story. According to one interpretation, the whole story of Aladdin was made up by him. by the peddler to persuade you to buy the lamp. How does he know the story in such detail? Well, he is the genie. It is his story. He throws stars in the sky as he begins. But if he is free and immortal, why has he chosen to reinvent himself as a peddler of the famous Dead Sea Tupperware? Because he is a combination of the ultimate inferiority complex, we are useless cheating merchants, and the ultimate superiority complex, but we own the story. However you look at it, he is a nameless sidekick character of dubious history and geography, the kind of which are killed wholesale by Indiana Jones. In the film Summer Holiday, Cliff Richard, on his way to Greece, travels to a travesty of my former country, Yugoslavia. There is a track on the album called Yugoslav Wedding, a silly combination of Dvorak Slavonic dances, a musical no man's land, a mishmash of anything goes, sung by men in sheepskin coats dancing a tribal dance. Cliff must have been given one of them as a present. This was a decade before Afghan coats became fashionable in the hippie era. Why would you need this backward foil for a rock and roll film? Well, obviously, to make the Technicolor more colorful and the rock music rockier. Every time I hear the word Iron Curtain, I shudder, and it makes me scream. This is my subscription card for the Yugoslav Beatle fan club, stating that I've paid my full membership for the year 1968. No, Yugoslavia was not an Iron Curtain country. It followed political non-alignment between the two blocs. We could travel freely around the world. We had releases of the Beatles and Antonioni on tap. Kafka and Camus were on my reading list in high school. We had awesome international theatre and film festivals and so on and so forth. But the more I defend my case, the more suspicious it looks. It becomes an academic footnote, and it sounds like bickering. Freud called it fetishism of small differences. The cliché waits for you, for one, for me, to first protest it and then get tired and embrace it and become one with it. But let us go back to Tintin. This is the cover of the book I mentioned. I soon discovered that the series was rife with racial and political prejudice. The very first Tintin book, In the Land of the Soviets, was commissioned in 1929 as anti-communist propaganda for children. It was followed by Tintin in the Congo. The author Georges Remy, also known as Hergé, later came to regret the poorly researched propagandist debut story and prevented its republication until 1973. It is the only Tintin story not to have appeared in color. The book has come under severe criticism for its racist colonial attitudes, and attempts were made around the world, including the UK, to restrict its availability to children. You can now only buy it in a tight plastic wrapper, semi-under the counter, like political porn. King Ottokar's Scepter is the 8th volume of the series. It was commissioned by the conservative Belgian newspaper Le 20e siècle for its children's supplement, and it was serialized weekly from August 1938 to August 1939. It was intended as a satirical criticism of the expansionist policies of Nazi Germany. It was a commercial success. It was soon published in book form. In 1947, Hergé colored and redrew the book. It was published in the UK by Methuen in 1958. It's also been adapted for TV. The story starts with Tintin discovering a lost briefcase in a Belgian park. Suddenly he is hurled into the kingdom of Sildavia at its capital, Clau. He warns the king about some Bordurian conspirators in his army who are preparing a coup. They want to steal the sacred scepter of Sildavia and annex the country to neighboring Borduria. Tintin manages to return the scepter and secure the monarchy. He becomes a Knight of the Order of the Golden Pelican, the first foreigner to receive the honor. The country of Moldavia is a mind-boggling combination of all kinds of mismatches. Bohemian history, nothing to do with the Balkans. Costumes from all over Middle Europe, mosques of Bosnia, insignia of Romania, flags similar to the Albanian Black Eagle, names influenced by Polish, Czech and Slovak languages, Cyrillic alphabet mixed with Latin, etc. This fictional country, kingdom, is like a setting for an operetta. It is somewhere elsewhere out there in Eastern Europe, like Ruritania from the novel The Prisoner of Zenda, or Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes. What is interesting is that this bundle of countries, after the Second World War, ended up under Soviet occupation in the Eastern Bloc, in what Milan Kundera calls the other Europe. Dina Jordanova writes in her book, The Cinema of the Balkans, but whereas the Balkan countries believe they are individually clearly distinguishable and expect to be treated as distinct from each other, the reality is that in the Western mind, they are lumped together via the vision of one big oriental periphery of Europe. One Herj biographer felt that King Ottokar's scepter showed a political maturity and that Herj was able to break free from the narrative limits of too much realism by the use of Moldavia as a setting. Excuse me? Never mind too much realism, how about some? The British expert on Tintin, Michael Farr, thinks that the adventure has a convincingly authentic feel due to the satirical portrayal to Nazi Germany, but that this was coupled with sufficient scope for invention with the creation of Moldavia. More than sufficient, I would say. Tom McCarthy, a literary critic, writes, Tintin's political origins lie on the right, to put it mildly. The Petit Vingtième was a strict Catholic newspaper, and, as Erich himself admits, Catholic at that time meant anti-Bolshevik, and it also meant anti-Semitic, and the paper's editor kept a signed photograph of Mussolini on his desk, and many of the journalists who wrote for him had links to more or less fascist Belgian party Rex. But then Hersch decided to reinvent himself politically, and in the 70s he became a liberal leftist. McCarthy argues, not without cynicism, in the media arts environment of the 70s, it was the most convenient place to be, just as collaboration was the most convenient path through the war. Through the erasures and rewriting, the same patterns repeat. Little wonder there are conferences on the politics of Tintin like this one last year at UCL. The fame of the books is at all-time high. Many bookshops have special Tintin sections, and I am sure that some of you came this evening drawn by Tintin in the title rather than the Balkans. Fans have adopted the Moldavian language that appears in the story and use it to construct grammars and dictionaries akin to the fan following of Star Trek's Klingon and Tolkien's Elvish. And now for something seemingly entirely different, but not really. This is the poster of the feature film To the Hilt, which opened in Macedonia in September last year. I wrote the script for it. Various versions of it. And I will now talk about certain Tintin-like cliches which crept into my own writing and how I struggled to weed them out. Back in the mid-80s, I was a young and cocky playwright with several successful plays under my belt. One day, an American businessman of Macedonian origin arrived in my hometown of Skopje. He invited me to a working breakfast at his hotel. If I would pitch him a story for a film, he would give me a check. As he was eating his scrambled eggs, I improvised the story. He then left. I never saw him again. I didn't see any money, but the story remained with me. The narrative is about Therese, a young and whimsical English lady who arrives as a tourist in the mayhem of war-torn Macedonia under the Ottoman yoke in 1903. She suddenly finds herself surrounded by 3 strong and very different men who pull her in opposing directions. She becomes a catalyst to a chain of dramatic events. An analyst would say that in my psychodrama, I must have been trying to work out the position of my English wife, Patricia Marsh, in my society at the time. Did I perhaps see her a little bit like Tintin in the Balkans? Therese meets 3 men. Philip, a young intellectual, medicine graduate, she travels with him from Paris. She stays with his rich parents and scandalizes the family. Krsto, a young rebel, disillusioned after a defeated uprising against the Ottomans. Muzaffer, a merciless Turkish officer, and needless to say, all of these 3 gentlemen take fancy of her. They say that the meaning of a film is usually in its last 10 minutes. This is what audiences take with them when they walk out of the cinema. So here is a brief description of what happened at the end of the first version of the script, which I wrote all those years ago in 1988. In a single combat, Krsto, the rebel, kills Muzaffar, the officer. The Ottoman army marches towards the town for reprisals. Suddenly, a mystery man appears. He is a character that we've seen throughout the film, but we have no clue of his dramatic function. He arrives in a car. Yes, a car in 1903. And here's a little snippet from the actual script. Therese gets into the car. The army is approaching. The mystery man looks calm. Pause. Therese, what are we going to do? Pause. The mystery man turns the car around and stops with the back of it facing the army. Therese gives him a questioning look. Pause. Mystery man says, lever. Therese, what? Mystery man, pull. Therese sees a lever sticking out from the dashboard in front of her. She pulls it. The car boot opens and reveals the barrels of a revolving machine gun. Mystery man, button. Therese, what? Mystery man, push. Therese pushes a button on the dashboard. A great round of gunfire is heard from the boot. The front row of the advancing Turkish army falls like 9 pins. Therese is delighted, and Therese says, this is what I call insurance. Panic breaks out among the Turks. The mystery man starts the car, and they drive slowly away. And Therese lets out a cry of joy. Cut. In the next scene, we are inside a train compartment at sunset. Therese and the mystery man are sitting in one of the compartments. She is looking dejectedly out of the window, and she's suddenly overjoyed to see Krsto and Philip galloping towards the train. And Philip, the medicine student, jumps on the train. He embraces Therese. Krsto stops his horse. Therese and Philip call out to Krsto, but he cannot hear them anymore. Fade out. And there was it. A tongue-in-cheek, clean, melodramatic resolution. Therese and Philip happily on their way to Europe. Krsto remains a loser he always was, and the bad Muzaffar is dead. This was an Eastern take of the Western of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The full title of my script was To the Hilt, A Tale from the Wild East. There were efforts to make the film at the end of the 80s, but they came to nothing as Yugoslavia fell apart. When I left Macedonia, I took my script with me. My friend director Stole Popov hated me for this, as he thought I would try to find another producer and director, and he was right. In 2001, a producer in London requested a rewrite to coincide with the current ethnic wars. I gave it a try, but without much appetite. I had lost the grasp of my target audience. I laid the script to rest. It was a young man's script anyway. There was some growing up to do at the beginning of the 90s. The wars were on. We'd lost our country. Soon I was busy writing other scripts. I joined Christchurch as a lecturer in screenwriting. I developed a methodology of practice-based research, primarily articulated through the affect of visual storytelling. But in the back of my mind, I would often return to the unperformed script of all those years ago and match my new theoretical insights against it. While reading post-colonial theories, I realized that the script dramatizes a fight for supremacy, a question of representation. Whose voice is going to be heard? Whose is the story? Who will own the narrative? Therese meets natives who are subalterns, marginalized characters without agency. They've long been silenced and now they demand their voice. Maria Todorova in her book describes the Balkans as a region geographically inextricable from Europe, yet culturally constructed as the other. The Balkans have often served as a repository of negative characteristics upon which a positive and self-congratulatory image of the European has been built. An innocent geographic appellation was transformed into one of the most powerful and widespread pejorative designations in modern history. Dina Jordanova, in her British Film Institute brilliant book, pushes this critique further. Quote, Balkan intellectuals are faced with the difficult question of how to combat this exclusion. Aware that their lands are geographically located in Europe, and yet feeling that somehow they are not a desirable partner within the European realm, they believe that their standing could improve if they made an effort to re-enter Europe. In order for this re-entry to take place, they feel obliged to be apologetic, and they are prepared to mirror stereotypical representations of themselves as part of an admission bargain, which they believe they can negotiate. This voluntary self-denigration takes various shapes, of which the self-inflicted exoticism easily discovered in cinema is just one manifestation. There are also other examples, for example, the widespread practice of self-bashing when interviewed by Western journalists, or their eager acceptance of the allegation of primordialism. Slavoj Žižek, writing about the famous Macedonian film Before the Rain, argues that despite intentions to the contrary, the director offers to the Western gaze what that gaze likes to see in the Balkans, a mythical spectacle of eternal primordial passions, of the vicious cycle of hate and love, in contrast to the decadent and anemic life in the West. In the film Zorba the Greek, the narrator of the story is a British writer, Alan Bates, who during a visit to Greece comes across the incredible individual, the flamboyant and colorful Zorba, Anthony Quinn. Whatever Zorba does in the film, and he does a lot of wild and exotic things, it is always conveyed to the audience through the aloof reticence of the Briton. Many of the scenes between the two protagonists take place within the cinematic frame that features Zorba at its center, dancing wildly, mimicking mischievously, or delivering a showy speech, and Alan Bates in the corner, observing Zorba's overexcited behavior with restraint. End of quotation by Giordano. In the original novel of Kazantzakis, a great writer, Zorba is a multi-layered, complex character. In the film, he's been flattened to a cliché. The very arrival of the Briton seems to have animated Zorba, as his life before the appearance of the foreigner and after his departure is deemed irrelevant and is left out of the narrative. He only exists in relation to the foreigner. Jordanova argues that this is a persistent narrative of travelogues in which foreigners wander into the Balkans as writers, journalists, hunters, or headhunters, and the list of films structured around the same plot of well-balanced and presumably sane Westerners who venture into the Balkan realm of barbarity is much longer, the list of films is. What is common to all these films is that their protagonists seem to be searching for the madness and longing to get exposure to it. And what's in it for the natives? Well, they get the brokerage of a Western narrator needed to validate the story. Jordanova. All this, over the years, rang alarmingly true around my old script. It had been harboring a narrative snake in its heart. I was happy to have pushed it to the side. Or so I thought. One fine day in 2010, my director and his producer rang to say that they got the money to do the film from the Ministry of Culture, and I was alarmed. Which script? The old script needed revision. I needed to protect my intellectual rights. I needed to warn my director and tell him about the insights I've had over the years. We mustn't repeat cliches of Europe as the whore of Babylon, the perfidious Albion, the imperial West who gives with one hand and takes away with the other. The director and producer thought that my protestation was a way of negotiating a better financial deal. To be honest with you, it actually served that purpose, I must say. In the summer of 2010, I was in Skopje and I met the director, who was very pissed off. And in a very short and tense meeting, I only managed to ask him one test question, which I usually ask my students. And the question was, whose story is this, Stole? And without thinking, he said, Krstos, i.e. the rebels. The meaning of the film is in his stance of fuck life if you're not ready to die for it. He'd obviously been rehearsing this. This was his film. And I feared, and I knew in my heart that my director is heading into the trap of Balkanism. I could see it clearly from the outside. He couldn't see it at all from the inside. The story can't be Krstos. He has no character development. He is a suicidal rebel at the beginning of the film as he is at the end. And what does this fundamentalist moral mean? Fuck life if you're not ready to die for it. How about fuck life if you have to die for it? No, no, no. It was urgent for me to go back to the drawing board. I decided to prepare a new draft and sit down with my director, and I made deep revisions, and I sent him the revisions, and I sent him a long letter. And then I signed the contract, and I sold my rights, and I never heard from him again. He made his own additions to the script, to the old script, which I never saw. I wasn't part of any of the phases of the pre-production, the shoot, and the post-production of the film, and I whimpered about this over the years to most of my colleagues at FRTV. And they said, Goran, that's the fate of a screenwriter, and they were right. But it still hurt. There were quite a few of the revisions which we did actually accept, except for the ending, which is what I'll be discussing in a minute. This is how the film ends in the revised script. Then I will show you how it actually ends in the last 2 minutes of the film, which I've got on my computer. At the end of the film, Krsto, the rebel, gallops on his horse, shouting, he wants a glorious death. He goes into an attack of the Turkish army, as if he's decided on absurd suicide and glory, but the army divides into two wings, and he gallops into an empty area, and they leave him behind, and he's just sitting there not knowing what to do with himself. That's the end of him as a character, which I thought was very nicely ambiguous. This is a quotation from the script now, how Muzaffer, the Turkish officer, and the young medicine man end what is their last appearance. There's a town square. Philip stands in the square. Muzaffer arrives on his horse. Philip welcomes him with a tray of bread and salt and brandy. Muzaffer takes a bite in his mouth. He drinks a glass of brandy. And Muzaffer says, I will put the town on fire. Philip, don't. Muzaffer, it's only fair. Philip, it's not. It's fair that we come to an agreement. Muzaffar, build, destroy, build again, damn it. Philip, exactly right. Let's find the middle ground. Cut a deal. Muzaffar, what kind of a deal? Philip, a brotherly deal. Muzaffar gives Philip a knowing look. Muzaffar goes away on his horse and Philip follows him on foot. The town is empty. There is pause. A dwarf appears and he comes to the center of the empty square. He finds a broken table and a chair. He sits down. He puts his feet up like a king. A limping dog appears from somewhere and comes to him. The dwarf pats the dog and the dog licks his palm. Cut. Exterior, the fields, day. Kirsto rides down the mountain slope. He can see the car in the distance. Therese looks towards him. Not him.
Great.
Therese looks towards him. She is shouting something. He cannot hear her. Fade out. These were some of the changes which I made regarding Therese. In the old script, there was little character growth in her. She was flatlining, frivolous, flirting with everyone. In the new script, she's a much more serious, much more complex central character. For Western audiences, she would be the character that they automatically align with. Therese knows about the situation in Macedonia. She has information about the rebellion. Her father, who's a diplomat, told her never to go there, and that's why she does it. He told her it would eat you alive, and that's exactly why she wants to go there. She is not unfeeling when she sees the atrocities. She is shaken to the core. She feels guilty and undergoes a moral crisis. In the love scene with Krsto, the rebel, she loses her virginity. She's very different from the flirtation in the first script. She is not a cool and calculated foreigner. She is not aware that her father has sent a mystery man to keep an eye on her and keep her safe. Totally different levels. In the end, she lives broken, with no intention of taking anyone with her back to Europe. And regarding Philip, in the old script he was a hedonist and an opportunist, but in the revised script he becomes a political pragmatist. He negotiates a business deal with Muzaffar to avoid reprisals and save the town, and he becomes very much like his father, who is killed in the course of the script. This means, or that meant for me, an overall change to the genre. The first version was melodrama with a happy resolution. The rewrite is a tragic comedy, a sweet and sour hybrid, an ambiguous piece which asks questions but offers few answers. For my money, to use the Nietzschean turn of phrase, the film is about gazing into the abyss and the abyss gazing back at you. Therese is an innocent abroad who wants to have a quick peep into the black hole, but then she has to look away and run for her life scared. My revision didn't really make it in the film. I wasn't there for the opening of the film in Macedonia last year. I dreaded to see it, and I only saw it recently with loads of wine on Vimeo. I still haven't talked to my director about it. It might be coming to the London Rain Dance Festival in October, and I will certainly make sure that I invite you all if that happens. I've just talked to some of the people there. Stole Popov is a great director. The film is 2 hours and 45 minutes of cinematic extravaganza. It is a sprawling epic with spectacular photography, excellent performances, superior production design. Still, I have a problem with how it ends, with where Stole puts the accent and the punchline. And these are the last 2 minutes of the film.
više ga pamti nego je ovo. Je zaboravio. Poslije bi se sjetiti. Pak je zaboravio.
Do you think anybody will remember this? They will forget. Well, they'll forget, but they'll remember again, they'll forget again.
I tebe isto. Što vidite znači? Jebate život, kako mi se smijem.
Fuck life if you're not ready to die for this. This is his last sentence, which Stoll wrote.